Good morning, 7th grade. Hope you guys are having a good time. And today we're going to be talking about the Hymenoptera class of insects. Now, the two words that come together to create Hymenoptera are hymen, which means membrane, and optera, ptera, which means wings. And so when you put them together, you get the membrane wing insects. Pretty simple. Now, Hymenoptera are very interesting because they're also very social for the most part. There are some that are not very social, but as you can see here, this order includes most of the social insects. And so we have things like bees, wasps, and ants. And so all three of these belong firmly in the Hymenoptera class. Now, social insects live in large communities of up to 1 million individuals carrying out different tasks. And so in one of these colonies, you might see up to 1 million different bees, or 1 million different wasps, or even 1 million different ants. However, not everything in the Hymenoptera class is a social insect. For example, we have some non-social insects such as the leaf-cutting bee, the mason bee, and the mud dauber. Now, right here, my highlighter out real quick. This is the mason bee. Now the mason bee looks very similar to every other type of bee, but there are some small differences, and it is a non-social insect, which means they may have small families, but they don't have a huge colony like the other ones we talked about. And this here is a mud dauber. Now, mud daubers look a lot like wasps, and that's how they survive for the most part. They look so much like wasps, nobody wants to mess with them. However, they are not wasps, and their main thing is just to make nests and to be annoying that way. It's very common if you leave things out for a long time and they're good, like, structures, in a sense, you will get a mud dauber nest. And mud dauber nests are super annoying to clean up. They kind of look like barnacles on the side of a ship, and you have to break into them and you need to destroy them in order to get rid of them, which is very difficult. But they are not wasps, and they do not hurt people. Now, when it comes to our social insects, we are mainly going to be talking today about the honeybee. And honeybee comes in 3 different flavors. We have the worker bee, the queen bee, and the drone. And we're going to talk about how they all work out. Now, honeybees are known for being around the world. No matter where you go in the world, more than likely you'll be able to find some honeybees. And there are some in Florida here. There's some in the Bahamas, where I'm from. And there are even some all the way over in China. There are honeybees almost everywhere in the whole world. Now, they show a great example of large insect communities. And so the honeybees come together and form a colony. That's what we call that. A big thing of bees is called a colony, which has one queen. And so that one queen rules over all of them, basically. Very similar to how Queen Elizabeth rules over England. She is the one queen. Well, in a colony, there is one queen, and basically calls all the shots. There are hundreds of drones, which are ordinary male bees. Now, over here, the drone is our larger guy here. And he seems to be fatter than the other ones here, but he's not as long as your queen bee. Queen bee is more slender. And the worker bee is kind of like a short, ordinary kind of bee. That's the one you're going to see the most often. And there are thousands of those worker bees in an ordinary colony. And they are all female. So drones are all males, and worker bees are all females. From there, we talk about how the queen's main function is to lay eggs. And so this queen's whole job is just to lay eggs. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs a day, and queen bees can live up to 5 to 10 years. So somewhere in that range is how long a queen bee can last, which is by far the longest that any type of bee lasts. And we're going to talk about that more in a bit here. Now, in the honeybee, drone's main purpose is to mate with the queen. And so that male bee its male purpose is just to mate with the queen. Fertilized eggs will then turn into females. However, unfertilized eggs turn into males. All the work is done by the worker bees. And so, ladies, you're doing all the work in this hive. That colony, all the work is done by those worker bees. The queen just kind of lays there and lays eggs, and the males, their main purpose is just to fertilize those eggs. Now, a worker bee's life starts as small as the size of a period. So you can see right here, like the end of a sentence, you can see this little egg. Now from there, the worker, 3 days later, the egg becomes a larva. And so that's this stage that you see right here. Kind of looks like a worm almost, and it's still inside of this cell. We'd call these cells right here. Then, the next thing that happens is 5 days later, they become pupas. Now, when they become a pupa, they actually get this wax covering over them. And so other bees will come by, usually the different worker bees that are working here, and they'll cover up the top of the larva, and it becomes a pupa. It goes through a lot of changes in this time. Then they undergo a process to become an adult. 21 days after the egg was laid, it's a full-grown adult. And so it takes 21 days to go from here to here. Now, the worker bee in general, the job of a worker bee is determined by how old it is. And so there are many different jobs that need to get done around the hive. And your age determines what you're doing. Some jobs include cleaning the hive. You might be maintaining the temperature of the hive, and they do that by buzzing inside of the hive and things like that. You might be nursing larvae, which is what we were talking about a bit earlier, how they get fed for about 5 days and then they get covered up so they can actually change into the type of bee they need to be. And they also may be in charge of guarding the hive. And so they might just be a little bit outside of the hive, just watching out, making sure what's going on here. Now, eventually they will go out and collect pollen and nectar. This is usually their last job, and so this is usually the last thing that a worker bee is going to do in their life. And their lives only last for 4 to 6 weeks on average. Worker bees don't live much longer than that. So if you see a bee coming around you, more than likely that bee is 4 to 6 weeks old, and it's doing its last job it's going to have. Now, it can go out and collect pollen and nectar basically as many times as it can, as it wants to, before it will end up dying eventually. Bees store the nectar in an organ called a crop. And so in the bee, there is a sac-like organ called the crop that basically acts like a bag that holds the nectar and pollen. And bees are known for being pollinators. Because it's a big part of their job to collect this nectar, they get covered in pollen when they do so. When they do that, they usually inadvertently pollinate the flower. And so that's a big part of that there. Now, worker bees, I got this really cool image we're going to talk about here. And it says worker bees can carry stingers. Well, worker bees do carry stingers at the end of their abdomen. And so, shortly after using their stinger, a worker bee in the honeybees dies. You can see here, there is this membrane that's going out from where the stinger was to where the bee is. Now, sadly, if you are ever stung by a honeybee, scrape out the stinger. Do not squeeze it. So you want to scrape it out with maybe a credit card or maybe a long nail or something like that. You do not want to squeeze the stinger, because when you do, more poison will go into your body. When they sting you, the reason it hurts so much is because they have a small amount of poison inside of them. And so when they sting you, that poison goes into your body. If you squeeze it, it makes it hurt even worse than it would have if you had scraped it out. Now, from here, we go on to the bumblebees. Now, bumblebees are a bit different from the honeybees, and you can tell that based on the fact they're so large. These guys are huge, and they're very fluffy. These large bees have colonies that only last about 1 year. Now, a honeybee colony can last a long time, usually up to 5 to 10 years. Bumblebee colonies, not so much. They last at most around 1 year. Bumblebees differ from honeybees in that only the queen lives through the winter. And so, usually in the winter, in a normal honeybee hive, they will mostly survive. But when it comes to bumblebees, everybody dies except for the queen bee. Now, queen bee buries herself underground and pops up during spring looking for pollen and nectar to eat. Now, when she gets enough pollen and nectar, she can start remaking her own hive. In the spring, she places food in a pile. So nectar and things like that, she puts in a pile around where she came out of the ground and lays eggs on top of the pile. Then she sits on them like a bird would. And so she sits on the eggs and she warms them up and she makes sure that they survive to the point where they can get food, they can eat, and they can become her servants for the most part. And you can see the different sizes of bumblebees here. You have the worker bumblebees, which range in this size here. Then you have the queen, which is much larger than anything else. And then finally you have the male down here. And the male is about the size of the largest worker bee. Bumblebees have smooth stingers. This means they can actually sting people multiple times, but thankfully they don't hurt as bad. And so if a bumblebee stings you, you probably won't feel as bad as if a normal bee stung you. And they don't leave their stinger behind, which means they don't have a serious issue with dying, which is really good there. Also, bumblebees have an interesting way of surviving. Around summertime, the worker bees will start raising new queens to make more colonies. And so that's why we have so many bumblebees. So you start out at spring, and the queen bee is making her new hive. Around summertime, there is an effort in the hive to make sure that the bumblebee race doesn't just die out forever, that whole species. And so what they'll do is the worker bees will start making new queens, and then those queens grow up and they get older, and then they survive a winter, and then they make their own colony, and the cycle continues over and over and over and over again until it's over. Probably going to keep on going until the Lord comes again. So that is where we are going to end today. Hope you guys are doing well. Keep on turning in that work. That's the only way I can give you a grade is if you turn in work so I can see it. If I can't see your work, can't grade it. Sorry. Well, thank you for listening. Hope you have a great day, and I will see you on Thursday. Thank you and goodbye.